statistically, though, to separate Black unemployment in the aggregate from what Black unemployment looks like in specific communities among particular age groups. So Black youth between the ages of 16 and 24 are still in particularly dire straits in terms of economic opportunities in many suburban and metro areas. I think that's important to know. And when we think of particular cities like Newark, like a Flint, like a Detroit, in some parts of my own hometown in Atlanta, folks are still dealing with a pretty substantial gap between opportunity and what their actual employment conditions are. And so it's important not to it's kind of like the weather. You can't talk about the weather in general, the forecast in a city, and have that speak to a particular neighborhood or what a climate looks like in someone's home. You have to kind of separate them. And so in that
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Mr. Andrew Wilkes, soon to be a PhD, right, Andrew?
That's right. That's right. Year 3, almost dissertation. Excited about it.
Yeah. Getting that doctorate. I'm gonna be on that level one day. I haven't gotten in it yet. But thank you for joining us again. You did a Courageous Conversations on social justice back with Ekimini. Was that last year?
I think so, man. Time is moving.
Yeah, time is moving at the speed of light. It's crazy. So I'm excited to have you back on the again. And now you are author. I'm so excited for you and the work you're doing. And the book is Freedom Notes. And I know you have a copy. So before we get into that, for those who didn't hear you on the Courageous Conversation episode with Ekimini, just give them just a little bit of background.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Atlanta, ordained minister, have spent most of my adult life and career working at the intersection of congregational ministry, community development, and economic justice, and pulled together Freedom Notes over the course of 3 years, really to help start what I think is an urgently needed conversation around 3 areas: faith, justice, and democracy. These are 3 intersecting things that are always ever before us. And so I'm really glad to be with you talking about it.
Awesome. So what made you want to, I know this is your passion. What made you say this needs to come out now? What was the urgency behind this message now?
Really great question. Well, I think there's a certain sense in which for Christians, there's always a nearness and nowness of questions around freedom. The first words we hear from Jesus are not only repent, but the kingdom of God is at hand. And so there's a kind of an urgency for freedom. But there's perhaps a heightened sense maybe of that urgency in terms of what some call the Black freedom struggle being at a particularly unique point where you have folks talking about getting free, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement, whether you see folks in Black evangelical spaces, whether it's The Witness, whether it's Truth Table, Jude 3, you see folks like goodness gracious, Dream Defenders. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So a part of what I wanted to do is to try to narrate through my own journey of getting free, and also to bring the resources of what I think is a distinctive Black social gospel tradition, which is different from a more kind of white social gospel tradition to this conversation.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned your own journey of freedom. What was that like? What was your own, can you share with our audience your own journey to freedom?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So I'm the son of Black physicians in Atlanta, Atlanta being the only city where there has been a successive Black-led mayoralty for the past 5 generations, starting in the 70s with Maynard Jackson. So I grew up in the kind of Jack and Jill, bougie kind of context. And while I appreciate, the educational and the kind of, in some ways, gilded upbringing that I had, over time, as I began to accept my call to ministry, and because of the unique commitments, I think, to public service that my parents instilled in me, I came to see that what freedom means for me is not about a kind of talented 10th notion. It's not about a kind of elitism, but it's about a kind of equalizing call to discipleship, to democracy in a civic sense, and to making sure that the work of liberation that I think the Spirit calls us to is something for me that often takes place within writing. And so I see writing as a critical area of ministry. It's not just, about people who see themselves as authors, but getting free for me has been through journals, through writing sermons, through Bible study lessons, and also through essays and articles in the book, Freedom Notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wrote my way to freedom, notes of freedom along the way.
What are some of those notes that you wrote for yourself?
Yeah, so I talk about a number of things. There's a piece in there about thinking through Ferguson as Christological response. And so many of us are familiar with feelings of grief and anguish when we see, yet another unarmed Black person, be they male or female, right, killed by disproportionate deadly force due to police or community folks. And so in that moment, I was grappling with the question I think many believers grapple with, which is, what does it mean to think of Christ in the context of what's happening in Ferguson? And in those kind of settings, a privatized, hyper-individualistic sense of God's providence and direction, it's just woefully insufficient to talk about how God moves through the world and how grace and God's justice takes place. And so in that piece in the book, I try to work through both celebrating what's happening in Ferguson. There were a number of churches, as well as a number of folks in the community, Reverend Tracy Blackman, Reverend Starsky Wilson, as well as folks just organizing. And so thinking through what happens locally, as well as just the church writ large, how we can move towards justice and freedom. So that's an example of one of the pieces that is there.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful. I remember us being at Southern in Baton Rouge doing our HBCU tour.
Mm-hmm.
And during the Q&A, Hebrew Israelite came up, and he was one was really irate, and the other one was kind of calm. And he got to the he was just like, he basically was crying out for, like, does God see us as Black people? And his explanation was, them believing we are the tribe of Judah, lost tribe of Judah, that we had to be cursed. And that was his resolve for him understanding the Black experience. And so I think it's important, like you're saying, to highlight, that intersection is for the Black freedom struggle and where Christ fits in, because we don't want people to think, oh, it's because Black people are cursed that we're experiencing this. Do you see that? Do you see that in New York, people coming to conclusions of being cursed as a reason why the Black struggle and trying to understand freedom and experience?
Well, New York has a long tradition of both anti-Blackness on the one hand, and on the other hand, Black arts movements, Black faith communities, Christian communities in particular, doing works of freedom. And so whether we're talking about, Marcus Mosiah Garvey and his movements, the UNIA in Harlem, whether we're talking about, Malcolm or a Baldwin or Gwendolyn Brooks, there are a number of folks you can point to historically. In a more contemporary sense, there are conversations around gentrification, around closing Rikers Island and what mass incarceration looks like in the city, as well as the state context, around the gap between and insufficient minimum wage, even when it scales up to $15 an hour. And in places like New York City, where buying a 2-bedroom apartment is still for many people out of reach, even with $15 an hour. And so when you think about that, it's a tempting conclusion to suggest, where's God in the midst of all of this? And a part of what I think I try to argue in the book is that God dignifies humanity by assigning a portion of agency, of co-laboring with God within history to move towards freedom, which doesn't mean that we are necessarily the senior partner, right? I think God preserves and reserves a kind of sense of kind of orchestrating history towards freedom. But it does mean that we have a critical, crucial role to play in New York City and in other urban, rural, and exurban areas. And so I think a part of what I really want to encourage folks to do is to think through how our gifts, our aptitudes, our passions in concert with others can create a symphony of freedom, because freedom is never a solo effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's important. And I appreciate you talking about those things that are taking place, especially in New York City and all across the nation, especially with gentrification. How do you think the church can help fight gentrification in our cities?
That's a really great question. I think it's important for the church to not only be engaged in the kind of prophetic dimensions of freedom, where we speak truth to power and say, far too many people are homeless, can't afford an apartment or get home ownership opportunities. That's an important part of the work. But there's also a kind of royal dimension of freedom. And by royal, I mean attending to the administrative dimensions of freedom and justice. And so when the church is advocating for community land trusts, advocating for things like public banking, these are structural policy responses that are pushing long-term housing affordability, that suggests that private property does not have to always and everywhere be the kind of default option, because this is, after all, God's creation. And capitalism is a human-created institution. It's not something that is inherently sacred, nor is any socio-political system, for that matter. Let me hasten to add. So once we begin from that premise, we can begin to advocate for policies that are independent of both Republican and Democratic parties and are in the best interests of our parishioners, of the congregants we serve, and of the people to whom we're inviting to discipleship. One way that I talk about it is this way, that there's a huge prayer disparity in the church. And the prayers that Black folks and Latinx folks pray in the altars of churches is categorically different than the prayers that people pray in the altars of white churches. And this prayer disparity is preventable. And a part of the work of freedom is closing this ugly, preventable prayer gap. And a part of the way that we do that is through having a structural concern for freedom that is proactive on policy and not just following whatever the convention or party platform is of any given institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's important, because I was talking to somebody in the major metro city, and he was talking about the fact that some white evangelical institutions were kind of aiding in gentrification and the displacement of Black and brown people in the name of the kingdom. So it's another aspect of colonization that is problematic and evil. So
call it by its name.
So I think it's important that we highlight that in the conversation, because obviously personal piety, if that's the only part of the gospel that you cling to, then you don't feel the need to dismantle the social structures that are there. So is that something else that your book is seeking to highlight as well?
Absolutely. I think on the question of personal piety, I think it's an important question to lift up. I have a piece in which I kind of talk about the Lord's Prayer as a resource for lament, for resilience in the wake of natural disasters, but also in some ways community disasters. And it's important for us to have multiple directions in which we move the inheritance of faith. There's personal piety, there's liturgy for Sunday, there's organizing on Monday and Wednesday, there's op-ed writing and giving testimony and community development. There's multiple directions in which we can go with this thing. And so part of what freedom means is breaking out of conventional categories about how we see problems and how we see solutions. Because if we have cookie cutter approaches to either problems or solutions, we won't be able to have a contextual, incarnational sense of what does freedom look like for us right here, right now. You know, Paul's letters are occasional. Paul is writing to Philippi. He's writing to, Ephesus to deal with specific issues happening then and now. And so a part of what Freedom notes and what I try to argue in the book is that we need to leverage the inheritance of our people and of Christianity in particular, in many ways, to address the circumstances before us.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. And I love that you highlighted the fact that it can look different ways. Mm-hmm. And it's not just, because some people say, well, I'm not good with marching, or that they don't think that's their thing, but there's something else they can do. It doesn't have to look like it looked in a particular time for us. And I think that changing method to keep the same message, but to tweak the method is important across, especially in a social media age where you see that, the power of hashtags and the power of Black Twitter. Marching can look like a Twitter movement in some instances. So it looks different. Not saying that marching is ineffective, because that is a means that we use that has been very helpful, that we still use today, that we need to do. But everybody won't march. Everybody won't be on social media. Everybody won't write an op-ed, but we can all do something.
Absolutely. And I think the heart of the idea of marching is about nonviolent direct action, and whether that looks like what Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris are doing in the Poor People's Movement, whether it looks like, as you mentioned, marching, writing op-eds, whether it looks like someone who is in business and they're wondering what does it mean to incorporate as an LL, as a B corporation, as an LC3, as an enterprise that's not about profit motives, but is about social and ecological motives as metrics for what effective delivery of programming and interface with community looks like. There's ways that we can think of, stuff that we don't often talking, a public interest attorney, being an accountant, culinary gifts that can be leveraged in the work of freedom. And it's really about a doctrine of vocation and gifts that is much more expansive than just over-valorizing what a preacher does in the streets, or over-valorizing what a politician or a judge does. All of those three positions are important, but there's a much wider tableau that we have as a priesthood of believers and as folks who God is inviting, to do this freedom work.
Yeah. And I love that you included our work, because I think, in our everyday lives, sometimes we detach what it means to fight for freedom in our job. So if we're an accountant, we work, but we don't necessarily attach that to what we can be doing as far as freedom in the larger space. And I think that's important, especially when dealing with
the book's got to get balanced.
Yeah. Like what you were saying, your background and myself, both of us growing up in a Black middle class space, so you have a little bit more privilege in that sense. Mm-hmm. Especially you growing up in the Black, you said Jack and Jill in Atlanta. It's a little bit more bougie than Jacksonville.
Fair enough.
But it's just that Jacksonville is kind of country. So
That's
So,
all right. I appreciate it all.
but so in that sense, we have more privilege. I remember Marvin McNichol's book. I think you're probably familiar with too, Preaching to the Black Middle Class. How do we leverage that our privilege in Black spaces to advocate for our own people? I think is important as well. What word will you speak to those who are in the Black middle class, the Black and bougie, the folks? How are we leveraging our experiences to help our own people?
Mm. I think it's important to recognize that, and what I try to keep in mind is that I don't want to speak on someone's behalf. I want to speak alongside with folks who, are lifting up their own voices for freedom. And, my presumption is that it takes a chorus to get free and to sing the songs of liberty and liberation that our foremothers and forefathers bequeathed to us. And I think that's important because a lot of times, kind of growing up in Black middle class spaces, there's the idea that you kind of superintend as a kind of race woman or race man, and you are kind of mentoring the underprivileged, is sometimes the language that's used, or that you are responsible for acculturating people into Black respectability, which often is acculturation into a kind of racial capitalism and white supremacy, which strips away their Blackness. And as it relates to Christ, it often kind of removes the hue of Christ, such that one just kind of has a disincarnate view of Christ that is utterly historically improbable in his position as a Palestinian Jew in the first century. And so a part of what I would say to folks who are Black and middle class is to always be engaged in that difficult work of self-examination and repentance, to think a chorus of freedom, how we can work together instead of us on someone's behalf. And then I think it's important to center a vision of freedom that is about liberation, not only for middle class folks, but also for working class folks. I think it's important to celebrate labor in all of its forms and shapes, and to make sure that all work is decent. And so for folks who are doing home healthcare work, janitorial services, construction work, it ought not be the case that there are incidents of workplace accidents. So we say you are in this context because you don't have an education or because you are insufficiently attentive to X or Y variable. I think God is interested in freedom across the board. So those would be just kind of a few words of advice. And part of, I think, a relevant piece that I think addresses that a bit. I talk some about what Freedom Notes kind of covers a span of the last kind of 8 to 10 years, and tries to really kind of set it in a particular moment when Obama was president, when we're dealing with recovery from the Great Recession, which in our communities, we still haven't fully recovered because homes were foreclosed on substantially, and most of Black wealth is actually rooted in homes. And so we're talking about Black unemployment still being depression level in some cases, not having wealth to fall back on when you're sick or when people transition into older age. And so we're in a context where it's easy for Black middle class folks to blame Black working class folks, instead of placing the blame on the system where it lies and claiming our power and agency wherever we are socioeconomically to move towards freedom, to claim that which God has given us to make liberation a reality.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to our 45 is in office, and he often highlights the fact that Black unemployment is at the lowest it's ever been. While that may be true, that number isn't necessarily reflective of our community and the problems still within our community. Can you just give a kind of overview of where Black America is economically?
So I can give a sketch. I don't presume to be able to give.
No, I know I'm not. I asked a big question.
My training is in political science, though I dabble in economics a bit. I think it's important statistically, though, to separate Black unemployment in the aggregate from what Black unemployment looks like in specific communities among particular age groups. So Black youth between the ages of 16 and 24 are still in particularly dire straits in terms of economic opportunities in many suburban and metro areas. I think that's important to note. And when we think of particular cities like Newark, like a Flint, like a Detroit, in some parts of my own hometown in Atlanta, folks are still dealing with a pretty substantial gap between opportunity and what their actual employment conditions are. And so it's important not to it's kind of like the weather. You can't talk about the weather in general, the forecast in a city, and have that speak to a particular neighborhood or what a climate looks like in someone's home. You have to kind of separate them. And so in that sense, I think there's still a need to make sure that, one, we're attentive to conditions of employment not being solid in many communities. I spoke a bit earlier about Black wealth taking a substantial hit. I think a part of what I would just say on that front is I think it's important to think of what does it mean to have a frame of common wealth and not just individual wealth creation. So when we talk about something like community land trust, that begins to be a housing solution that pushes back against displacement residentially, that pushes back against lots turned towards office towers, as opposed to how can we have housing solutions that make sense for us. When we think about things like credit unions, and I mentioned public banks, this gives opportunities for small businesses, for homes, for nonprofit institutions, and just a different way of imagining what our communities can look like. And so, and then of course, educationally, Black young adults and other demographics, but particularly young adults, are still saddled with tons of student debt, and so we're dealing with incredible obstacles on that front, and making sure that there's a clear policy preference for, I think, tuition-free, not only college, but community college options, which are accessible and available. It's critical as well.
Yeah, I think those are very, very important. And I love how you highlighted the student loan debt, because people will say, well, this generation is more educated, but this generation is burdened by the debt of that.
Absolutely. We need to run through the streets of Sally Mae and so forth, crying Jubilee, Jubilee, the years at hand.
I know, right? I wish that those debt cancellation prophecies work, because that would be really helpful now.
But there are examples, and I think in terms of generating hope, because hope is a precondition of moving towards freedom. For-profit institutions like Corinthian College have been held accountable under the Department of Education of the previous administration. And even though the terms of restitution and paying back what was lost is kind of being slow walked by 45's DOE, it's important to note that in principle, there has been policy and to some degree legal agreement that folks have been defrauded, which creates a government obligation to make it right. So to some extent, the indebtedness created by private institutions in higher ed is being rolled back a bit. So there are glimmers of hope and freedom among us, and we celebrate them.
Yes. What other things would you like to highlight about your book that we haven't already discussed?
It's a great question. I'd like to highlight that, I think it's important to think on a couple of wavelengths at the same time. In one sense, I think it's important to note that we are always making a deliberate choice when we're reading scripture. There's a book, there's a piece in here that I have called Sexy Spectacles. And I try to encourage some of my Black male colleagues in ministry to always opt for the freeing and liberating interpretation. Because there's times when, if one is reading a story, if one is reading a parable, even in some cases an epistle, one can move towards a constrictive or liberating interpretation. And it depends on how one brings other texts into play, one's theological framework. And I think it's important to recognize that even in something as straightforward and everyday as reading our Bibles, we can participate in loving the Lord with all our mind and helping to push toward freedom. So that would be one thing that I would say, and spend a good deal of time talking about it. The second thing, which I would say, is that the book will, I'm doing some pre-release events. Started in Chicago and will be in Atlanta this Saturday, July 14th, and will be in 7 or 8 other cities over the next few months. But one message which I'm trying to share everywhere is that this conversation includes, but of course transcends this particular book. The goal is to make sure that we're writing our own notes of freedom and are being attentive to the cries and conditions of unfreedom in our communities and throughout creation, and are ever ready to be mobilized into God's expansive work of freedom and creation.
Awesome. Well, how can people get your book, and how can they stay connected with you via social media?
So I'll take the latter and then go backwards. So on Twitter and Instagram and so forth, Andrew J. Wilkes, Wilkes. The book, again, will be available everywhere in the fall online. But I do have some pre-release copies from the publisher. And as I noted, I'm doing some events over the next few months in Philly, in Boston, going back to my alma mater, Hampton, Virginia, in September, I believe. So I'll make sure to share all of those on social media. So follow me. Let's talk freedom and continue this critical work together.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And I am excited for you about all the great things you have coming up with your events and your book. So God bless you.
God bless you. Always a pleasure to be on the Jude Free Project.
And one of the things I believe God has pressed upon me to press upon you is to raise a generation of Christians that are courageous and are not afraid to speak the truth in love.
Imagine what would have happened if he didn't listen to her because she was a spoil of war, because she was too young, because she was a woman. Wow. He would have missed out on his healing.
I didn't ask God why when I became the first black woman to receive a PhD in Old Testament. I didn't ask God why when I became the first black woman to become the Lyman Beecher Lecturer at Yale. I didn't ask God why when Spelman made me the Cosby Visiting Professor. I didn't ask God why when I became the first black woman to receive tenure at Vanderbilt University. I'm surely ain't gonna ask God why now that I've got cancer.
I have hope that is hard fought, hard won, and it's real.
To unflinchingly denounce the politics of fear and the alt-right racism that elected playboys, while denouncing a black man who was loyal to his wife all his years in office.